In the autumn of 1907, a small surveying party stepped off a steamer at the port of Valdez, Alaska, carrying sealed orders, 3 months of provisions, and a set of brass instruments worth more than most men in the territory earned in a decade. There were 9 of them: a lead surveyor on loan from a Pittsburgh syndicate, 2 assistants from the United States Geological Survey, a Yale geologist, a Tlingit guide hired in Sitka, 2 packers, a cook, and a quiet man with no listed profession whose name appeared in the ledgers only as Mr. Hollister. They were photographed once at the dock. The photograph still exists. It is the last confirmed image of the entire group together. They walked north out of Valdez on the 8th of September into the Chugach Mountains, and they were never publicly seen again. No bodies were ever recovered, no instruments were ever returned. No final report was ever filed with the Geological Survey, with the syndicate that funded them, or with the Department of the Interior that licensed their expedition. The official record states that the party... I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. He was lost to weather. The unofficial record, the one buried in the ledger books of 3 different banks and in the personal correspondence of 2 senators, tells a very different story. Because what those 9 men were really sent to find was not a mountain pass, and not a glacier, and not a vein of copper. They were sent to confirm something far stranger, something that, if confirmed, would have rewritten the financial geography of the United States in 1907 and would have made certain men in New York unimaginably rich. And the moment those 9 men did not come back, that information, whatever it was, became one of the most carefully buried secrets of the early 20th century. To understand why a group of surveyors vanishing in Alaska mattered to anyone in 1907, you have to understand what Alaska was in 1907. It was not yet a state. It was not even a fully organized territory in the modern sense. It had been purchased from the Russian Empire 40 years earlier for a sum the newspapers of the time had mocked as Seward's icebox. By 1907, that mockery had been replaced by gold. The Klondike strike of 1896 had filled the Yukon with prospectors. The Nome strike had followed, then Fairbanks. By 1907, Alaska was producing roughly $20 million a year in gold, a tidal wave of wealth moving south into the vaults of a handful of banks in Seattle and San Francisco. But gold was no longer the most interesting thing in Alaska. By 1907, the men who read the geological reports, the ones who sat behind closed doors in New York and Pittsburgh, were looking for copper. The age of electricity had arrived. Edison's lights, Westinghouse's alternating current, the telegraph, the telephone, and the streetcar systems being laid in every major American city all required one thing in vast and accelerating quantities. They required copper wire. The country was being wired together, and the man who controlled the copper controlled the wiring of an entire civilization. The great copper fortunes of the late 19th century had been made in Montana, in the mines around Butte. But by 1907, the easy copper of Montana was being stripped out, and the smart money was looking north. And the smart money had heard, through channels that left almost no paper trail, that somewhere in the Chugach Mountains, in a valley a Tlingit hunter had described to a missionary, who had described it to a clerk, who had described it to a banker, there was a copper deposit unlike anything ever seen in North America. Not a vein, not a seam, a mountain whose face, the story went, was streaked with green and blue ore so pure a man could break it off with his hands and ship it directly to a smelter without crushing it first. The story had been circulating for nearly 20 years. Most men dismissed it as a prospector's tale. But in the spring of 1907, 2 things happened that changed the calculation. The first was that a sample of ore, weighing about 3 pounds, was delivered anonymously to the assay office in Seattle. The assayer, a careful man named John Birchfield, whose private notebooks survive in the archives of the University of Washington, recorded that the sample tested at over 70% pure copper. He had never, in 20 years of assaying, seen anything like it. Most copper ore of that era ran between 2 and 5%. 70% was, in Birchfield's own written words, impossible. The second thing that happened was that the Morgan and Guggenheim syndicate, which had been quietly acquiring claims and railway rights across southern Alaska for several years, accelerated its purchases. In April of 1907 they bought 3 steamships. In May they secured exclusive freight rights on the only deep-water port in Prince William Sound. In June they began surveying a railroad route inland from a tiny coastal settlement called Cordova, a railroad that would, when completed, run nearly 200 miles into territory no one had ever found anything worth shipping out of. And in July they hired the 9 men who would walk out of Valdez that September and disappear. The leader of the expedition was Frederick Lyle Bremerton. He was 41 years old, a mining engineer who had worked in Montana and in northern Mexico, with a reputation for ruthlessness, accuracy, and absolute discretion. He had worked on 3 previous surveys whose findings had never been published, and he had been paid handsomely each time for that silence. The 2 USGS assistants were younger men, Caldwell and Pruitt, both in their late 20s, both graduates of the Colorado School of Mines. The Yale geologist was Dr. Edwin Vance, a specialist in what was then called economic geology, the science of finding things in the earth that could be sold. The Tlingit guide was a man whose name appears in different documents as Charlie Koo and as Charles Cooper. He was the most experienced wilderness traveller in the party and the only man among them who had ever set foot in the upper Chugach. The packers and the cook were local men from Valdez whose names are barely recorded. And then there was Hollister. Mr. Hollister, he travelled with no listed employer. He carried, according to the dockmaster's notes, his own separate set of locked cases, and he is the figure around whom the entire mystery of the 1907 expedition eventually turns, because Hollister, as we will see, was not a surveyor at all. The party left Valdez on the morning of the 8th of September. The weather was clear. They had 3 pack animals, which was an unusually small number for 9 men carrying 3 months of supplies, suggesting that they expected to cache provisions early and travel light into the interior. Their stated objective, written into the permits filed with the territorial governor, was a glaciological and topographical survey of the upper drainage of the Tasnuna and Tikal rivers. This was a respectable scientific objective. It was also a cover. The country they were entering was not a country of glaciological interest. It was a country of mineralogical interest. And the route they took, reconstructed years later, from interviews with a packer who turned back on the 3rd day, did not follow the rivers at all. It cut northeast into the high country between the Copper River and the Chitina, into a range of unnamed peaks that on the maps of 1907 were simply blank. Terra incognita. The packer who turned back, a man named Olaf Henriksen, said later that he had quit the expedition because Bremerton had ordered all of them to stop keeping personal journals on the 2nd day. Henriksen thought this was the sort of order a man gives when he does not want a record of where he has been. He took his pay and walked back to Valdez, and because he turned back, he lived. He was the only man associated with the expedition who lived to old age in Alaska, and he died in 1953, still telling the same story to anyone who would buy him a drink in the bars of Cordova. Henriksen said something else too in his later years. He said that on the 2nd night out of Valdez, around the fire, the man called Hollister had taken out a small leather portfolio and shown Bremerton a folded paper. Henriksen had not been able to see the paper clearly, but he had seen Bremerton's face when he looked at it, and Bremerton's face, Henriksen said, had gone the colour of old ash. Then Bremerton had folded the paper back up and said only 3 words. He had said, "So it's true." And then he had walked away from the fire and stood alone at the edge of the camp for a very long time, looking into the dark. For the first 2 weeks things appear to have gone according to plan. We know this because Bremerton, despite his order to the others, kept his own field book, and that field book, or rather a partial transcription of it, made by a clerk in 1909 before the original disappeared, survives in a private collection in Pittsburgh. The entries are brief. They record elevations, weather, the names of streams, and the angles of slopes. On the 17th of September, the entry reads simply, "Crossed the divide, descended into the basin, saw it for the first time." There is no further description. Saw it. Saw what? The basin that the party had descended into was, by Bremerton's own coordinates, a small valley tucked between 2 ridges in what is now the eastern Wrangell Mountains. It was a valley that, on every map made before 1907 and on every map made after, was simply blank. It was a place that did not officially exist. And whatever Bremerton saw there on the 17th of September, he never described it in words, he only sketched it. The sketches, 2 of them, were torn out of the field book at some point before the transcription was made, and noted in the transcription as missing. We do not know what was on them. We only know that they had been there and that someone at some point had decided that they should not be. The next entry in Bremerton's field book was dated the 21st of September. It read, 4 days in the basin, the assays confirm everything. Hollister sending the packets out with the runner, the rest of us continuing east. And here we encounter the first hard piece of evidence that this was no ordinary survey. A runner. The expedition had launched a runner, a single man, almost certainly the Tlingit guide who knew the country, sent back toward the coast with sealed packets of samples and documents. The runner did not return to Valdez. He went instead to Yakutat, nearly 200 miles to the southeast, where he handed his packets to a clerk working for a small shipping company that was, on paper, independent, but that was, in actual fact, owned through 3 layers of intermediaries by the same Pittsburgh syndicate that had funded the expedition. The packets were placed on a steamer to Seattle. From Seattle they travelled by rail to Pittsburgh. They arrived in Pittsburgh on the 14th of October. We know this because the syndicate's internal correspondence, subpoenaed in an unrelated antitrust proceeding 19 years later, contained a single reference to the arrival of, quote, the Bremerton material, end quote, on that date. The contents were never described, the packets themselves never appeared in any public record, but we know from a memorandum dated the 15th of October that within 24 hours of those packets arriving in Pittsburgh, the syndicate began executing a series of stock transactions that amounted to one of the largest single repositionings of industrial capital in American history up to that point. In the space of 9 trading days, the syndicate quietly liquidated something in the region of $40 million of holdings in established American copper companies, Anaconda, Calumet and Heckler, Phelps Dodge. And with the cash freed up by those sales, they began acquiring 2 things. The first was every available share of a small and largely unknown firm called the Kennecott Mines Company, which held a single set of claims in the eastern Wrangell Mountains. The second was every railroad right-of-way, every port lease, and every steamship contract between the port of Cordova and the interior of southern Alaska. By the time the markets closed on the 28th of October 1907, the syndicate controlled, through holding companies and nominees, the entire infrastructure required to move ore from the eastern Wrangells to the smelters of the Pacific coast. They had not announced anything. They had not published anything. They had simply, in the space of less than 2 weeks, repositioned the financial geography of an entire industry. And they had done it on the strength of whatever Hollister's runner had carried in those sealed packets out of the Chugach. While this was happening in Pittsburgh and New York, the 9 men in the mountains had gone silent. The last entry in Bremerton's transcribed field book is dated the 28th of September. It is 1 sentence. It reads, weather closing, must move to lower ground. The dog has not eaten in 2 days. After that, nothing. The transcription ends. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. The original field book, the one the clerk worked from in 1909, vanished from the syndicate's records sometime in the 1930s and has never been recovered. Where the party went after the 28th of September, no one knows. They did not return to Valdez. They did not come down to Cordova. They did not turn up at any of the small mining camps scattered through the Copper River country. They did not light signal fires. They did not send out a second runner. They simply, as far as the outside world was concerned, ceased to exist. It is important to understand how strange this was. Alaska in 1907 was a wild country, but it was not an empty one. There were trappers and traders and prospectors moving through almost every drainage of the southern coast. There were native villages along every navigable river. There were missionaries and revenue agents and the men of the newly formed Alaska Road Commission. 9 men in a known geographical area do not simply vanish. Someone somewhere sees something, a trace of a camp, a discarded tool, a footprint in fresh snow, a trapper who came across an empty cache. In the case of the Bremerton expedition, none of that ever materialized. There were no traces. There were no rumors from the bush. There was, in the words of one frustrated investigator working for the territorial governor in the spring of 1908, an absolute and unnatural silence. That investigator's name was Albert Ross. He was a former Pinkerton operative who had taken a position with the territorial government and who had been ordered in February of 1908 to find out what had happened to the Bremerton party. The order had come from Washington, from the office of the Secretary of the Interior, who was under pressure from at least 2 senators, both of whom had financial interests directly connected to the syndicate. Ross spent 4 months in southern Alaska. He interviewed every person who had had contact with the party before its departure, including Henriksen, the dockmaster at Valdez, the assayer in Seattle, the clerk in Yakutat, and the captain of the steamer that had carried the runner's packet south. He attempted to interview the syndicate's representatives in Pittsburgh. They declined to speak to him. He attempted to obtain copies of the expedition's permit documents from the territorial governor's office. The files were, he was told, being reorganized. They were not, in fact, available at all. When Ross submitted his final report in June of 1908, that report ran to 240 pages. It contained extensive interviews, careful geographical analysis, and a series of pointed observations about the financial transactions of the Morgan and Guggenheim syndicate during the autumn of 1907. The report was filed with the Department of the Interior. It was marked by an unknown hand with a stamp that read, "Hold pending further investigation." There was no further investigation. The Ross report was never made public. It was, however, preserved because Ross had been a careful man and had kept his own personal copy in a safe in his home in Juneau until his death in 1932. That copy is now in the holdings of a regional historical society in southeast Alaska, and it is from that copy that almost everything we know about the actual conduct of the 1907 expedition has been reconstructed. What did the Ross report contain that was so dangerous it had to be buried for a quarter of a century? The answer is not a single revelation. It is a pattern of timing, of money, and of identity. The timing pattern is the simplest. The syndicate's enormous repositioning of capital, the liquidation of $40 million of Montana and Arizona holdings, the consolidation of every transport asset in southern Alaska, all of this occurred in a window that began the day Hollister's packets arrived in Pittsburgh and ended approximately 3 weeks before the bottom fell out of the New York stock market in what would become known as the Panic of 1907. The syndicate was already in cash and already in possession of unannounced control of a future copper monopoly at the precise moment when the rest of the American financial system was collapsing into one of the worst banking crises in the country's history. While other men were ruined, the syndicate was perfectly positioned. While other men were forced to sell, the syndicate was free to buy. And the asset they would shortly reveal to the world, in the form of what would eventually be called the Kennecott Copper Corporation, would over the next 2 decades produce ore at a rate that no other copper operation on the planet could match. The money pattern, the second pattern in the Ross report, traced the actual flow of capital through the holding companies and nominees and trust accounts that the syndicate used to obscure its true position. Ross had not been able to penetrate all of it. No one could have, given the tools available in 1908, but he had identified enough threads to demonstrate that the men ultimately receiving the profits of the Bremerton expedition were not, primarily, the men whose names appeared on the public corporate documents. The primary beneficiaries were a small group of investors operating out of New York and London whose holdings spanned not just copper, but railroads, banks, and a controlling interest in a major eastern newspaper, which would over the following decade ensure that the story of what had really happened in the Chugach in the autumn of 1907 was never published, never developed, and never investigated by any organ of the American press. The identity pattern, the third pattern in the report, concerned the man named Hollister. Ross had been unable to find any record of a Mr. Hollister in any registry of mining engineers, geologists, surveyors, or assayers in the United States. He had been unable to find a passport application, a hotel registration, or a railway ticket bearing that name in connection with travel to Alaska in 1907. He had concluded that Hollister was a pseudonym. He had then attempted, by working backward from the dockmaster's description, from Henriksen's account of the firelight conversation, and through the personnel records of the syndicate, to determine who Hollister actually was. He had narrowed it down in the surviving copy of his report to 3 possibilities. All 3 of those names have been redacted. The redactions appear to have been made by Ross himself. We do not know who Hollister was, but we know what the 3 redacted names had in common, because Ross had written, in an appendix, a single sentence describing them. He had written, all 3 men were principals of the syndicate, none had any technical training in geology, and all 3 were known personally to the President of the United States. The President of the United States in October of 1907 was Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt's relationship to the great industrial syndicates of his era was famously combative in public and famously complex in private. He had built much of his political identity on trust-busting, on the breaking up of monopolies. But Roosevelt also understood as a practical matter that the United States needed copper, needed it in vast quantities, and needed it under American control rather than under the control of British or German interests that were also quietly hunting for the next great deposit in 1907. There is no evidence that Roosevelt knew about the Bremerton expedition specifically, but there is evidence that he knew about the Kennecott operation in general, that he met privately with 2 of the syndicate's principals in the spring of 1908, and that the antitrust pressure his administration had been preparing to apply to the syndicate's holdings was quietly redirected in the months following those meetings toward other targets. As for the 9 men in the mountains, the question of what actually happened to them on or after the 28th of September of 1907 remains, in the strictest sense, unanswered. There are theories. The official theory, the one the syndicate eventually allowed to circulate through friendly newspapers in the early 1920s, was that the party had been caught by an early and unusually severe winter storm and had died of exposure. This is plausible, but it does not explain the absence of any physical trace. It does not explain why no bodies, no equipment, no remains of camps were ever found in subsequent decades of prospecting and surveying in the region. There is a second theory, quieter, that the party was lost in a glacial event, swallowed by a crevasse or buried by an avalanche, in which case any remains could have been carried away inside moving ice and might still be there, slowly emerging from a glacier face as the ice retreats. There is a third theory, the one Henriksen believed and that he told in the bars of Cordova until his death, that the party did not die in the mountains at all. Henriksen believed that the syndicate, having received the runners' packets and having confirmed everything they needed to confirm, had no further need of the men in the field, and that those men who had seen too much were quietly eliminated, perhaps by men sent in after them, perhaps by the man called Hollister, who had walked among them from the beginning, carrying not survey instruments, but a very different set of tools in his locked cases. Henriksen had no proof of this. He only said, repeatedly, that he had looked into the eyes of the man called Hollister on the second night out of Valdez, and he had known then that not all 9 of them were going to come back. What we are left with more than a century later is an absence of bodies, of records, of any clear narrative, and in that absence a single hard fact. The Kennecott copper deposits, when they were finally brought into full production in 1911, were exactly what the rumours had said they would be. The richest single concentration of copper ore ever discovered in North America. Veins that ran in places at over 70% pure metal. Ore that could be, in the words of one Kennecott engineer, shoveled straight out of the ground and into the smelter. Over the operating life of the mines between 1911 and 1938, they produced more than 1 billion pounds of copper and more than 9 million ounces of silver, a total value that ran, in modern terms, into the tens of billions. And every single dollar of that output flowed to the men who had positioned themselves to receive it in October of 1907. In the days immediately after a runner had emerged from the Chugach with a set of sealed packets that had told them, in language we will never read, exactly what 9 men had seen in a nameless valley between the Copper River and the Chitina. The expedition of 1907 is not, in the technical sense, an unsolved historical mystery. Most American historians of the period know in broad outline what happened. The Morgan and Guggenheim Syndicate, which would shortly evolve into the Alaska Syndicate, used the tools of capital, of secrecy, and of political influence to acquire control of resources. Before their value became publicly known, the 1907 survey is a textbook example of that practice. What is mysterious is not the why. The why is greed in its purest industrial form. What is mysterious is the human cost. What is mysterious is the names: Bremerton, Vance, Caldwell, Pruitt, Charlie Coo, also known as Charles Cooper, 2 packers and a cook whose names barely appear in the records at all, and a man named Hollister who was almost certainly not named Hollister. 9 men who walked out of a port town one September morning and were, for all practical purposes, erased. Erased not by accident, but by the deliberate operation of a system that had decided their continued existence as named locatable, traceable human beings was inconvenient to the larger project they had been hired to advance. The men of the Bremerton expedition, if Henriksen was right, were not destroyed by Alaska at all. They were destroyed by an office in Pittsburgh and a trading desk in New York, by a calculation made on paper, by men in good suits who never went anywhere near the Chugach Mountains and who, when the news of the party's failure to return reached them, simply made a note in a ledger and moved on to the next transaction. The frozen giants of Alaska in this telling are not the mountains. They are the bodies still up there somewhere, preserved in ice that does not melt, holding the only physical evidence of what was actually seen in that nameless valley in September of 1907. And the longer the climate warms, the closer we may come to a day when those frozen giants finally surrender what they have been holding. A field book, a sketched map, a photograph in a tin case. Any of these returning from the ice would be enough to confirm what the Ross report only hinted at and what the official record has spent more than a century denying. Until then, the story stands as it has stood since 1908. 9 men walked north. None of them came back. A railroad was built, a fortune was made, and somewhere in the eastern Wrangell Mountains, in a valley that does not appear on any map, the wind through the ice is still the only voice that remembers